question. We'll go to the audience for your views as well. Dr. Kim, just to change tacks a little bit, you mentioned in your remarks the Korean Peninsula as being a big strategic flashpoint in the relationship. We at the U.S.-China Business Council and the economic community are always looking for positive signals of things that could positively impact the U.S.-China bilateral trade relationship. We saw yesterday that North Korea announced that it would resume working-level denuclearization talks. And I wonder if you view this in any way related to the U.S.-China relationship and perhaps President Xi and the Communist Party trying to indicate that they're a responsible stakeholder in the region and can be helpful for the the United States strategic interests in the region.
Well, I would say when it comes to North Korea, it's never just a positive story. So, I mean, this morning they just, tested a medium-range ballistic missile, and so I think that's, people are trying to figure out what happened there, what's going on, if that's going to, impact the working level negotiations that are scheduled for next week. In terms of, what role is China playing in all of this, I would say China is certainly not the primary driver or behind North Korea's negotiating strategy at its point, or its decision to come to the working level talks finally after many months. I think if anyone's in the driver's seat, it's North Korea, and it's been delaying for a variety of reasons. But you mentioned, can China potentially play a constructive role in this, or is there a bright spot for U.S.-China relations? And I think the Korean Peninsula, is one place in East Asia where the U.S., China, Japan, South Korea, and others, share some genuine common interests, especially in preventing war and ultimately in denuclearizing North Korea. But there are also conflicting long-term interests. So North Korea presents, I think, both an opportunity and a risk for China in that sense. I think if negotiations move forward, many of Kim Jong-un's demands for security concessions, whether it's ending all U.S. ROK military exercises, or reducing the United States troop levels in Korea, or ultimately sort of weakening that alliance, that's in line with China's interests, and so it will be supporting North Korea as it negotiates along those lines. But if talks were to break down and North Korea went back to nuclear or ICBM, long-range ICBM testing, we would see pressure in South Korea and Japan to do more on the military front. We could see the U.S. bringing more strategic assets to the region. We can see trilateral cooperation going up, and all of these would cut against China's long-term security interests. And again, if the U.S. were to turn back to some sort of military pressure campaign to the level where the survival of the Kim regime was at stake, I think Beijing may feel the need to intervene. So, when it comes to North Korea, it's both the opportunity and the risk, again, for China. And I think we're going to have to watch to see where this situation goes. I think everyone's kind of nervous. North Korea, I think when they saw Bolton go, maybe thought that was an optimistic movement, and then you see news of impeachment, right after that, and so they're probably feeling the deadline as well. So we'll see, how this evolves.
Terrific. Jude, just to drill down into one of the points that you made on Hong Kong, when I engage with the Trump administration on economic issues, they often lead with Hong Kong is the number one issue we're thinking about today. And as one person told me, if Hong Kong goes sideways, not only will there not be a U.S.-China trade agreement, there's very likely to be no U.S.-China relationship for a while, depending on the amount of intervention and how visible that is. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about what I would consider to be the restraint of the Communist Party from intervening in Hong Kong. Why has that happened, and what can we see on the future for that potential?
Yeah. Before I do that, can I just add one thing into this meta discussion we're having about did we get the U.S.-China relationship wrong, and were we all sort of Whiggish utopians in the 1990s on where China would evolve? I would say in a distinctly American way, as we've been having this discussion, we never really stopped and paused and looked at what the discussion in China was in the 1990s and the 2000s, and there, across the spectrum on both left and right in China, there was a belief, especially on the hard left in China, that accession to the WTO and a series of economic reforms that were happening in the 1990s about restructuring state-owned enterprises was a clear signal that the Communist Party was kind of raising the white flag and was looking to be overtaken by neoliberal forces and as they say, change its colors. So I don't mean that as dispositive on our, one way or the other, on our discussion about China's political trajectory, but at least in terms of the intellectual debate in the 1990s, both the left and the right were very much seeing a direction of China that was looking to integrate more, liberalize to some extent, and was seeing the role of technology trade as playing sort of a universal acid role in terms of eroding some of the old party dominance. So just put that in there. And on the Hong Kong issue, I see it much the same way in terms of my read about how that would impact the politics here. It's not only folks. I mean, if you go up on the Hill, if you're down the State Department, Hong Kong is the big issue right now because there's a collective breath holding as we try to figure out how the CCP will intervene, if it will intervene, and there's kind of two sides of this discussion right now. One side says it would be far too economically costly and logistically difficult for the Communist Party to use either its paramilitary force, which is called the People's Armed Police, which, to go back to my earlier point, used to report to the State Council, the government. Military restructurings a couple of years ago, the People's Armed Police now reports directly to the Communist Party Central Committee, of which Xi Jinping is officially the core. So it tells you something about how he's thinking about this. Reports came out by Reuters 2 days ago that during a normal, quote-unquote, normal military rotation of the People's Liberation Army garrison in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago, that several thousand PAP were smuggled in, so that now you've got a force in Hong Kong of People's Liberation Army, the military, and People's Armed Police of upwards of 12 to 15,000. China has also, for the past month, been making a very public display of amassing PAP on the border in Shenzhen. So they clearly think the threat is credible, and some of the imagery and rhetoric that came out of the 70th anniversary parade of the show of military strength and capability, as well as remarks by Xi Jinping, were clearly aimed at intimidating folks in Hong Kong. So the question is, if China intervenes, and again, for simplicity's sake, this is not a binary intervene or not intervene, it's a spectrum. It could do a bunch of things along that spectrum. I think there's folks up on the Hill who are frustrated with the Trump administration, who are locked and loaded on Hong Kong. And if there's anything, including we had a death yesterday, a live ammunition shooting of a protester yesterday by Hong Kong police. Deaths that result in deaths in Hong Kong could be the trigger for U.S. action. We have this bill right now, which is going to be passed, I would guess, Human Rights and Democracy Act, which looks to potentially reverse Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a unique trade status as a result of a piece of 1992 legislation where it's treated separately than mainland China in terms of its trading status. So that's potential leverage that the U.S. government could use to raise the bar for, or at least raise the threshold for Beijing on action. But I see this as really being a tipping point, and using this both for legitimate and for political reasons to really press go on a lot of actions, regulatory, legislative actions that are a result of pent-up frustration on China, where China's going, but also with the Trump administration. And I do agree that this all but, if this tips over, I don't see politically how you could come to even a mini trade deal, given the political optics of this, because the Trump risks being flanked on his left and his right. You know, on his left you have Democrats. I don't know if you saw Chuck Schumer's tweet yesterday, castigating Trump for wishing China a happy 70th birthday party. And Schumer said, "Why are you wishing this communist regime happy birthday party?" So the left flank, including Democratic candidates, presidential candidates now. And then you also have the right flank. So this is the sort of Steve Bannon and Kyle Bass group, who are the bomb throwers, who have, who represent some of Trump's base. Neither side wants to see Trump come to see success even on a mini deal. So I think Hong Kong just adds to that pressure.
All right, we're going to open it up now to questions. I'm going to ask you one quick question follow-up, Jude, though. So the Human Rights and Democracy Act, let's assume it gets passed this week.
Yes.
Will the president sign, veto, or delay?
Sign.
So we're going to take questions. We have a mic runner. Remind folks, WITA ground rules, say your name, affiliation, and please try to ask your question in the form of a question. Start right there.
I didn't mean to scare away all that people by asking a question.
I think it was more about us than it is about you.
Thanks. There's several questions that came up, but one of them at least got partly addressed to about Hong Kong. So let me go back. I think it was Dr. Kim that mentioned the Korea-Japan conflict or relationship right now. And I'd like to do a little deeper dive, each or any of you, into that. And I'm sorry, Jim Colby with the German Marshall Fund. I'd like to do a little bit deeper dive into that and just tell us what is China's role in this? What do they see? Do they see an opportunity to drive a wedge here? Is the United States aware? Are our policymakers aware of this? Are we doing anything to try to stop it, or is it just going to just take a hands-off approach to this? And what are the opportunities for China in this?
Yeah, I'm sure Dr. Kim has some thoughts on this as well, but you know, some of this is episodic, where Japan and South Korea will have a period of increased friction, and then it gets better, and so forth. The United States in recent years, except for this, have played a pretty strong hand in trying to manage that so things didn't get totally out of control, to the point where, you know, President Obama had trilateral summits and sort of said, okay guys, you know, let's get along here. This latest flare-up is mostly traced back in part to the change of government in South Korea, but also to a Supreme Court decision in South Korea that allowed South Koreans to sue Japanese companies for essentially reparations for the use of slave labor for women and stuff like that during World War II, whereas the Japanese had reached this deal with South Korea under the previous government that was supposed to be final for all time. We're never going to talk about this again. We've sort of created a fund and all of this. So that's kind of where things stand there. The President Trump has been asked about this and said, essentially, yeah, I'm here if they kind of need me, but you know, in order to manage this, it would take a whole lot of time, and I'm pretty busy. I mean, that's almost exactly what he said publicly. When John Bolton was National Security Advisor, he and then the Senior Director for Asia went out to South Korea and to Japan and tried to kind of mend things behind the scenes, but it's pretty late in the game, actually, at this point. I mean, both sides are really dug in publicly, and it's very hard for them domestically to walk back from the level of hostility. Of course, this creates an opportunity for China and an opportunity for North Korea, because the bottom line is Japan is not actually a threat to South Korea, and South Korea is not actually a threat to Japan. And in fact, depending on what contingency you envision, they need each other. And yet, you know, we're back to the point where if you go to Seoul or if you go to Tokyo, you know, half the meetings in Seoul they want to complain about the Japanese, and half the meetings in Tokyo they want to complain about the South Koreans. We got bigger issues among the allies in Northeast Asia than that, but domestic politics and the sense of history is what it is. So in my view is that a much stronger American hand needs to be enabled to try to bring these guys together. There are things they would do trilaterally, they're never going to do bilaterally, but we've really got to play a very, very active role.
I mean, I think Richard laid it out nicely, and I would just add a finer point to that. You know, it's important to note that there is this deep sense, you know, there's this deep turmoil over political history, and it's not something we could wave away as, you know, coming in waves and flows. You know, this time around, so the court case is about Korean slave labor and people feeling that they have the right to sue the Japanese companies, you know, on an individual basis, whereas Japan says, no, this was all taken care of in 1965 when we paid South Korea reparations and when we normalized relations. I think the sentiment in South Korea is that, you know, yes, those reparations happened, but it happened under an authoritarian government where people had no say in what deal was struck. And, you know, there's this sense that Japan hasn't really fully come around to recognize, the misdeeds of colonizing Korea, or recognizing that that was not the right thing to do. Whereas in Japan, there's a sense, oh, the Koreans, they just want to stick to the past, they keep dragging this out. We settled this in '65. The comfort woman issue was settled, several years ago under a different administration. And so there's this sense of, just, they feel very tired there as well with these issues. But having said that, I think, the US certainly has a role to play. It has the convening power. I think we should be using it at the highest levels. And my sense is that this needs to be dealt in a dual track way. So, in one track, you need to deal with the pragmatic security issues that are there, like the big North Korea issue, the long-term threat of China. And on the other side, you do need a track that's dealing with these deeper historical issues. And I think it's going to take generations to get over this, but I think it'd be good to separate it. And I don't think the US should play a leading role in that history track, but recognizing that, I think it would be very useful and would help both leaders in the two countries to come together. In terms of China exploiting this division, so I don't think China is necessarily exploiting this particular division, but it is certainly benefiting because, as I said, China sees South Korea as this country it can sort of peel away from the US-led alliance system because of South Korea's anti-Japanese sentiment that it shares with many in China, because of many other issues, its economic dependence on China and so on and so forth. So it certainly doesn't help the US, Japan, South Korea triangle when we need it to be operating more robustly in the region.
We'll go back to the audience. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, Bill Lane with Trade for America. My question is, where are our allies? And just to sort of set the stage, the U.S. has imposed massive tariffs on China. We've imposed tariffs on just about everybody else as well. But no ally has really matched those tariffs or even done any tariffs against China to support the cause. The Belt and Road Initiative is picking up momentum. I know we still are critical of the initiative, but when you're in Africa and other places, people are cozying up to it, let me put it that way. At the same time, the U.S. is bragging about massive cuts in U.S. assistance. And the last thing, and this was probably the most concerning that I've just heard, the country that the U.S. has the largest trade surplus in the whole world is Hong Kong. So are you telling me that's illusionary or it's going away real quickly? Because it'd be nice to have a few countries where we have large trade surpluses.
Hong Kong's not a country.
But it's treated separately as far as trade taxes.
Mr. Fontaine, you want to?
Sure.
Maybe just in reverse order, I'm here with a bunch of folks who think about trade far more than I do, but I think we're, as a government, we're on the wrong track in using trade surpluses or trade deficits as a singular measure of the economic health of a bilateral relationship, and this has infected our entire approach to China. My view is that the president is right to be tougher with China, particularly on some of its economic practices related to intellectual property theft, unfair investment rules, some of the ways the state-owned enterprises are used. But to look and say, thou shalt reduce your trade deficit, if you do, that's great, and if you don't, that's horrible. Maybe I've taken too many economics classes over the years, but that just doesn't seem to be the right objective, and yet that is the top objective, as far as I can see, of the president's approach to China. His secondary objective has been get its cooperation on North Korea, which has subsided now that we're in this kind of diplomatic dance with North Korea, but a year and a half ago or so, that was kind of objective number 2, with the idea that we're going to get an agreement with North Korea. So when we step back and look, if the number 1 objective is to get China to reduce its trade deficit with the United States, if number 2 is help us get a deal on North Korea, I think both of those are wrong. And therefore, we might have some of the right tactics, but they're aimed at the wrong objectives. So anyways, I don't know if that is any way an answer to the specific question you brought up on that, but just as an aside, my take on the possibility of a trade agreement between the United States and China is not that it turns on what happens in Hong Kong, because you don't need the Congress to have a trade agreement with China. You could, and if I'm President Trump, I'm looking to the election next year. As long as you keep this trade friction going, you say that Joe Biden and the other Democrats are bad negotiators and weak on China, and you're going to hold the line and push for strong outcomes, which only obtains until there's actually an agreement, which everybody can shoot at, so you have an incentive to keep this going as long as possible. Then you look at the danger that the economy is actually going to turn down before the election, and you say, well, what can I do about it? I got fiscal policy, except that I can't get another tax cut through the Democratic House. I've already raised taxes, and we already borrow $1 trillion a year. I'm sorry, raise spending, we already borrow $1 trillion a year. I don't control the Fed as much as it might be interesting to do monetary policy. The only arrow I really have left in the quiver is to get a deal with China, and so look for a China trade deal on domestic political reasons, like next summer or something. Speculation, who knows? But to me, the domestic political drivers and Trump's autonomy to get that deal is far more important than all of the dastardly things that China might do in the interim that would make it unpopular on geopolitical or human rights grounds. The last thing I guess I'll say is just on this question of the allies, and it's tricky because a lot of the allies are in a way behind the scenes in a situation similar to the United States where there's not a binary choice. It's not like the Cold War. There's an Eastern Bloc and there is a Western Bloc, and you're either in one and you're all in, or you're in the other and you're all in. Every country like us has a strong economic relationship with China that it doesn't want to put at risk. It also has deep skepticism about what China is doing and its future intentions, and so it's hedging there. And so as the United States, we have to approach our allies knowing that they're not going to just say there's one strategic China choice, we're against China with you. It's actually much harder than that. There's a million individual China choices about what's more important on this issue or that issue or this other issue. We have to work with them on all that, but doing that with a greater degree of positivity on our allies would be welcome.
We've got about 4 minutes left. You start having your hand up. Can I ask the microphone to go over here? Gentleman in the pink shirt, white beard.
Thank you, Jean-François Wattin with MEDEF French Business. I have two quick questions. Number one, about the disappointment in this country, maybe Washington, about the lack of liberalization in China. Why should we believe that this administration is interested in actually promoting liberalization worldwide when we read statements coming from the highest part of the administration? And the second question is responsible stakeholders. Couldn't the point be made that China, in some areas, is a responsible stakeholder? I'm thinking in particular about climate change, where at least they talk a good talk, as opposed to some who not only don't talk a good talk, but try to develop their CO2 emissions as much as they can.
I'm going to take the first question, if that's okay. So I think the reason that it's important to recognize that the administration is focused on China's liberalism is the substance of the trade agreement that they're trying to negotiate. The trade deficit gets all of the headlines, but the reality is the core focus is market access, reducing equity restrictions, it's reforming industrial policy, it's reducing subsidies in China's economic system, and it's about state-owned enterprise reform. So I would say that while there are certainly parts of the administration that do have a different strategic perspective on the role of the U.S. and China, the key aspects of the trade agreement through which they're willing to impose several $100 billion of tariffs indicate that there is a strategic focus on that. But for his second question about China being a responsible stakeholder in some areas, I don't know, Jude, Dr. Kim?
I guess just a real quick point is I would not, a lack of leadership by the United States does not therefore mean that there's a leadership shown by China. And I think oftentimes what we're really saying is where the heck is the United States, rather than, gosh, China's really at the lead on these things. Because absolutely there's a high level discussion on China on the catastrophic environmental pollution that's happening domestically in China, and it's struggling with its own confused mess of industrial policies that on the one hand support digging coal out of the ground and burning it based on economic growth exigencies, with the longer term concern out of social stability, but also livelihood for the Chinese people. So China's more in the game rhetorically on climate change than the United States is, but I think that's different from it really showing leadership. And again, if I'm looking at this from a holistic perspective of China as a global actor, we really can only find a few specific areas where we're seeing a real leadership from China, and in far too many areas I see a sort of an illiberal disruptor coming from China, and I suspect, looking down the road, that will increasingly be the case, but I've been wrong 99% of the time when I talk about China's future trajectory, but this one does have me concerned, because it's no longer tenable to talk about a pendulum swing in China's political domestic system. We've become accustomed to seeing, don't worry about this tightening period, the reformers will make an upsurge. Talking about a reformist swing under Xi Jinping is like talking about a reformist swing under Donald Trump. It's just structurally very hard, next to impossible to see that happening. So I suspect we're on a one-way ratchet of continual tightening, and the party looking to increasingly expand to protect its own core interests. So to Patty's point earlier, even looking out on China as a global actor, a lot of this is pull factors. China may not have the desire to fill in the blank internationally, but in the same way, 15 years ago, we would have imagined that China would have an overseas military base, right, in Djibouti, but it's just the nature of protecting your own core interests at home demands you be moving farther afield to get a sense of security, gain access to resources, and feel like you're writing the rules.
And the last word to Dr. Kim.
I mean, I would say that climate change is precisely one area where we could certainly use more Chinese leadership, and that's where the past U.S. administration was pushing for China to do more. And so, as we talk about issue by issues or case by case, where do we want China to be more active and to have more leadership? Where is that dangerous? I think climate change is one place where we certainly want China to play a bigger role.
And that concludes today's panel. Please join me in thanking Patty.
Thank you very much.